Hello, I'm Charles Mallett with the UK Column interview, and today I have with me William Dalrymple. William, a very warm welcome to UK Column, and thank you for joining me.
Very, very nice to be invited on. Thank you.
Not at all. Now, I would say that we're going to try to tackle a big subject today, and that is, your special subject, empire, effectively, but specifically, and not wanting to lure you into tricky territory necessarily, but to deal with the idea that what we see in the world around us now is only really to be made sense of with the context of history. And I think in particular the relationship between state and corporate power. And so just as an easy opener, what I would put to you or ask you is, what does it say about British history that outside the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office sits a statue of Robert Clive of India?
So I should perhaps declare an interest here. I spent the last 25 years writing 4 books on the East India Company, which is, I suppose, my special subject. They are The Anarchy, White Mughals, Return of a King, and The Last Mughal. And between them, they now appear as a sort of box set of the company quartet. And it's the story, which I think is surprisingly little known, because I think people tend to think of the story of British imperialism as being a state enterprise led by the state and the British Army and the Royal Navy and commanded from Downing Street. And I think it's often forgotten that a great deal of the work of empire, and this was not just the case with the British Empire, but it was also the case with the Portuguese and the Dutch, and many others, were led by private corporations. And the most powerful, most successful of those was the corporation which I've spent the last quarter century writing about, which is the East India Company. And the East India Company is an extraordinary story. It is a private company with shareholders, with an annual general meeting, with a share price that was listed on the stock exchange. And yet it was also the conqueror of the largest and richest country in the world in the 18th century, which was India. India in the 18th century controlled about, or produced about, a quarter of the world's GDP. Through most of history, that's true that India and China between them produced up to about 80% of the world's GDP, and Europe was not as central as we're perhaps taught in our schools to imagine it to be. And the 18th century is one of those moments when India actually overtakes China. There's not many of them, but throughout the 18th century, particularly the Indian textile industry was extraordinarily rich and successful. And it was that attracted the British and the French and the Dutch and the Portuguese to trade initially and then conquer chunks of the country. And eventually it was the East India Company which took over the whole of India. And it did that, astonishingly, with its own private army. India was later garrisoned by the British Army, but throughout the 18th century, the conquering of it was done not by the British Army, by and large, though there were occasionally British Army units involved. Most of the work was done, and most of the manpower came from the East India Company's own army, which was separate, which was controlled by the directors of the East India Company, and which was far larger than the British Army. The British Army in 1799, just as it was beginning to rearm to fight Napoleon, was about 100,000 soldiers. The East India Company army in the same year had just short of 200,000 sepoys. And so it was literally double the size of the British Army. And this whole enterprise was run out of a single office in London, in Leadenhall Street. For much of the 18th century, it was a rather modest Georgian building, 6 windows wide. In about the 1820s, it was enlarged into something that looked a bit more like Buckingham Palace and took over a great chunk of Leadenhall Street. But throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, it was just 6 windows wide. It had no big placard outside it. there are engravings of it with Georgian gentlemen in frock coats wandering past the railings, apparently unaware that anything was going on inside. And yet, out of this building, the conquest of the richest country in the world was organised, and the East India Company took advantage of the breakup of the Mughal Empire, for which it was not responsible. Incidentally, it happened independently and was about internal Indian politics and then invasion from Persia with Nadir Shah in 1739, who ran off with the entire Mughal treasury, leading to the fragmentation of India. And at that point, the East India Company and their rivals, the French Compagnie des Indes, sort of fought it out. And the English East India Company, under Robert Clive, who you asked me about, was the victor. And Robert Clive is an extraordinary character. I mean, he's one of the most interesting characters in British and Indian history. He is someone who won almost all the battles that he engaged, of the many that he engaged in his life. Initially as a military man in India, working for the East India Company. He fought a very unconventional style of warfare for the 18th century. 18th century warfare was often very formal, with sort of lines of infantry and cavalry and artillery on the flanks, and everyone sort of wore bright red uniforms and lined up and exchanged cannonades and then sort of charged at each other. Clive didn't do that at all. Clive attacked from the rear at night, at 4 a.m. in the fog, during thunderstorms, terrified his opponents consistently, and was a brilliant general. He then went back to England, where he engaged equally successfully in the boardroom warfare of the City of London, and eventually became the boss of the East India Company and outwitted his rival, Sullivan. And finally, as an MP, controlled a great chunk of the British Parliament, because East India Company men were returning back from India throughout the 18th century with vast fortunes. And there was an extraordinary situation by the 1780s when, I can't remember the exact statistics off the top of my head, but something like a third of parliamentarians were East India Company returnees who'd come back and bought rotten boroughs, and something like, is it 80 or 90%? I can't remember the exact figure of MPs had East India Company shares. So the East India Company, which was the largest single employer in Britain, with its own enormous army, double the size of the British Army, also had an incredibly influential effect on British politics. And to a certain extent, you could argue that they invented corporate lobbying, this business that still goes on today, whereby donations are given to political parties for a covertly expressed pro quid quo, which is never openly declared, but which is expected often by the donors. And the East India Company learnt how to refine its corruption. One of the I think the first governor of the East India Company ended up in the Tower of London because he started bribing MPs very early on with cash in hand to extend the company's monopoly. And I think in very early years, 1605, 1610 or something, the company had a monopoly which had to be extended. He was caught bribing people. And since then, it refined its technique so that the East India Company became in many ways the father of corporate lobbying, and found ways of offering, campaign donations and putting its own men up for rotten boroughs and so on. So that by mysterious alchemy, the interest of the East India Company became the interest of the British Parliament. And what was good for the East India Company became foreign policy. So as well as, in a sense, conquering India, in a very different way, it conquered Britain and controlled its body politic in a way that no institution had ever done before. Arguably since the time of the Magna Carta and the barons being sort of confronting the state with warfare. You've never had an institution capable of bending the state to its will. So it's, as you can hear, a very modern story, although it's a story of the 18th century, and the company's finally wound up in 1858 by an act of Parliament. And in the final analysis at the end, this long battle which had gone on for 150 years between the power of the state and the power of the corporation, ultimately it's the state that wins. And the East India Company is disbanded, according to the Times, with less fuss than a regional railway bankruptcy. So despite, in the end, that round is won by the state. But the methods that it pioneered of influencing a legislature, the precedent that it formed of a multinational, and it was also fascinatingly a kind of shapeshifter. It's different things at different times. It starts off as very much a London enterprise, London merchants wanting to buy spices and compete with the Dutch, who'd just done successful voyages to the Spice Islands, which were not India, which were far distant Indonesia, and the Banda Islands close to Papua New Guinea in the modern map. And that goes on for about 40 years, and they do less and less well against the Dutch, who've got better ships and better finance and better ways of raising capital. And eventually they get kind of kicked out of the East Indies, as Indonesia, as we would call it now. And the Dutch win, and there's a face-saving treaty whereby in return for the Banda Islands, the British get given a completely useless island in the middle of the Hudson River called Manhattan, which is a kind of face-saving swap. Of course, in the end, it turned out to be quite a valuable swap, but it didn't do. At the time, no one realised what a good deal the Brits were getting. And over the course of the 18th century, the Brits realised that they've actually got the better deal because they relocate to India and they focus on the textile trade, which is the big 18th century product that they deal with. And so India's making these extraordinary textiles, all sorts of fancy textiles called kalamkaris and silks. But ultimately, the kind of body of the trade was simple cotton, what they call piece goods, which is rolls of simple white cotton that the British export for the Mughals all over the world, and so much so that you get sort of deindustrialization in Mexico by the late 18th century as the East India Company cotton undercuts everything everywhere else in the world. It's such high quality. And then, so having started as a spice export business, which went wrong, and then become a textile business, they suddenly realized that their business model of shipping English gold out to India to buy the stuff is unnecessary. And they have now, thanks to the military revolution of the 18th century in Europe and the collapse of the Mughal Empire, that their new methods of warfare developed by Frederick the Great in Prussia, which they've adopted and has been adopted all over Europe. New 18th century ballistics, horse artillery, file firing and infantry, and so on and so forth, that this allows them to actually conquer great chunks of India. And from the 1740s through, particularly in the 1750s, the Battle of Plassey, the Battle of Buxar, and finally with the battles against the Marathas and the Sikhs, the East India Company conquers using Indian troops and borrowing capital from Indian bankers, which it repays very promptly and therefore is the favoured lender of the Indian banking dynasties. The East India Company extends its way over the whole of India. Then they realize that they can grow in the marginal land opium poppies, which they then export to China, and they become the largest narco operator in the world, in world history. And they sell poppy from India to China. They buy tea in China, which they sell in India, Europe, and in America. It's East India Company tea that gets poured into Boston Harbor at the Boston Tea Party. And by the 1780s, they become this massive multinational. They own most of India. They are making vast sums of money out of China. They're subverting the parliament in Britain, and they're thwarted by the American Revolution from extending their influence into America. So what started off as a sort of Elizabethan Amazon in a garage of Sir Thomas Smythe, who was the Jeff Bezos in this analysis, they end up the most powerful company in history. And over the 25 years I've been writing about it, we've seen the growth of companies such as Apple and Meta and Microsoft, who, like the East India Company, had profits which they presented at annual general meetings greater than that of whole nation states, and with the ability to subvert nation states either by war or by bribery. And they become quite incredibly powerful. But it's a story which speaks to us today, because we see today these massive corporations with enormous resources.
We absolutely do. I mean, obviously, you're absolutely specialist subject, but in a way, an unfair question to ask you to condense quite so much into one thing. But it's there, and there is a lot to go back to from what you've just said. But I think exactly where you ended up with this idea of there being phenomenal corporate power. Let's just go back to 1858, because you made the point there that in that instance the state won, but you have also just referred to the state being subverted. So is it the case that actually the state in 1858 was quite dramatically different from the state as it had existed over the course of the previous centuries, and therefore, if we consider the individuals, because of course actually this is really a tale of a chain of individuals, and you might say that greed has played a great part in this. So I mean, who in terms of the individuals really won in 1858? Do you really think that it was the state in the way that it had been a couple of hundred years previously, if that makes sense?
So there'd been a growing agitation in the course of the 19th century over the fact that it was very odd that it was a corporation which was controlling Britain's most important colony. And after the loss of America in the 1780s, and the increasing importance of India to the British economy in the early 19th century, the oddity that it was a company, not the Crown, which was running this colony, became more and more apparent, and more parliamentarians raise it. But the companies companies seize off various attempts in the early 19th century to isolate it and defang it. And ultimately, it's the Great Indian Uprising, which we call the Indian Mutiny in Britain, but which in India is called the First War of Independence. And this is Armageddon. This is the most enormous anti-colonial uprising in history. Hundreds of thousands die, and they very nearly succeed in throwing the Brits out of India. It's a series of complete chances. The telegram sent out of Delhi on the day that the thing breaks out to the rest of India, which allows the East India Company to disarm the sepoy regiments who are restive elsewhere, recruit new troops under a different banner from the Sikhs and the Pashtuns in the northwest, and basically just managed to get. Also, the fact there's a flotilla of army troops heading on their way to China who are diverted to Calcutta and march up the Ganges and defeat the sepoys. All these things mean that by the end of 1858, the whole thing has been suppressed, and the Brits are back in control. But it has been the most obvious, unquestionably a complete mess, and many British women and children have been killed. Far greater numbers of innocent Indians have been massacred. And this is the point where everyone disagrees. Right, we've got to find a new way of running this show, and the state takes over. I think you could make a case that had it not been for that uprising, that the East India Company would have found ways to continue operating for much longer.
Absolutely. I mean, it very much sounds like it. Why on earth, given what you're saying, would they have, done anything other than that if they'd been able? The element I'd like to sort of introduce here to ask you about, because of course, when we think of similar, I mean, not altogether similar, but the situation now with these incredible corporate sort of behemoths that dominate the space, and what might loosely be described as public opinion about them. I know that is a difficult term to use, because of course the public has many opinions, and many different elements of the public would have different opinions. But by this time, what was, or indeed did, the public mood, such as it may be described back in Britain, have any impact on what was going on, and was that changing, was that evolving as the company was evolving?
So one of the biggest surprises for me researching this history over 25 years was how angry quite a lot of Brits were about the East India Company. I think people assumed that people thought imperialism was fine in the 18th, 19th century. It's only a modern liberal sensibility that means that we oppose oppose imperialism today. In reality, there's an astonishing amount of resistance to the East India Company in the 18th century. Some of it is jealousy. You have people minding kind of nouveau riche nabobs returned from India, possibly with dodgy Indian wives, in the views of the locals, turning up and buying, getting rid of some old buffer who's been the MP for 40 years, buying up his house and taking over. And in the same way that people in the 1980s used to dislike merchant bankers crashing their Porsches into restaurants and letting off fire extinguishers and misbehaving. And you get a bit of that in the 18th century. You get people disregarding these as sort of monstrous, nouveau riche, jumped up merchants. But people like Clive were booed in the streets, and there was, for example, after the Bengal famine, when maybe 1 million Indians died in Bengal, with the East India Company not bothering to set up a single soup kitchen. The same famine strikes areas under Indian rule, and Indians respond as they've always done to famine, by setting up soup kitchens, creating, building massive monuments which they didn't really need in order to employ people during times of famine and paying them a basic wage. And so, for example, in the Kingdom of Awadh, there is a very strong response by the Nawab, and very few people die, although there's a great shortage of food. Under the East India Company, 1 million die. And this is reported by whistleblowers. There's no foreign correspondence in those days. You've got no sort of CNN people jetting in, or Christina Lamb turning up for the Sunday Times. You've got East India Company whistleblowers writing to the Spectator and the Gentleman's Magazine and Blackwood's, describing horrific scenes of starvation. And this becomes widely known in Britain, that the company has just been, effectively murdering 1 million people, doing nothing to save it, and sending out vast profits to London, and all these people still retiring with enormous fortunes while all this is going on. And you get plays put on in the Haymarket where Clive is mocked as Lord Vulture. And various other nabobs whose names are now not well known, as the other characters in this play, and they get hissed in the streets of London. And in the end, Clive, is the best ever example of Indian karmic theory of sort of that your just deserts will come to you. Clive commits suicide. He cuts his own wrists. In a deep depression over the fact that he can't go out without people booing him. So whenever some of my right-wing friends sort of tell me that my views are very sort of much those of the liberal modern establishment, I say absolutely not. This is decent people have always opposed famines, massacres, genocides throughout history, and that equally there've always been those who've said that profits, business must continue. But I have to say I'm rather proud of the British response to the East India Company. You get an awful lot of resistance to it at the time, and some very brilliant writers such as Horace Walpole writing eloquently about the evils of conquering another people, sucking out their wealth and looting a country.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. I think the interesting thing that drops out of that is, or at least what I'd like you to sort of describe, if it were a thing then. I mean, now corporate communications are such that those sorts of stories would be suppressed so incredibly vigorously and actually effectively, because, of course, in today's communications space, so many of the big companies that you've just described actually control the communications networks. But did the East India Company at that time have the ability to direct the press or have media channels of their own? I mean, how was that
interesting
managed?
question that I'm ashamed to say I haven't examined, and it's a very interesting thing to follow. I will make a note because no, I don't think the East India Company. I didn't know of the East India Company controlling the press, but it's quite possible that they did, and certainly journalists were for hire then as they are today. But what you do find is that, particularly after the Bengal famine, particularly after these whistleblower reports by the East India Company's own servants, anonymously writing back horrible reports of bodies piling up in Calcutta and corpses in the Ganges and dogs eating babies and cannibalism and people selling their children into slavery and stuff. When all this appears in the British press, it also appears in the American press and plays a very important role. It's 1784 that the Bengal famine happens. Sorry, 1774 the Bengal famine happens. And you find a lot of American patriots very alarmed that the East India Company has been allowed to sell tea in Boston, and saying we are not Marathas. We will fight for our freedom from the East India Company, and so its reputation was known even in America. Very interesting.
No, it is. I think it's fascinating, and as I say, given the situation now and the incredible efforts corporations will go to maintain control of the particular narrative that is important to them and their business.
I think you've come up with Charles, with a very good idea for someone's PhD of the East India Company in the press. I don't think it's been done, and I think it's a very interesting idea.
Well, but then again, how does one get to it? And this is what I was going to ask you actually, as an historian. How is it that you make that decision when you're scouring through this, that, and the other? How do you decide when you've hit upon what you think is the most likely truth, for want of a better word? And the reason just to go further with that, because you've just talked about reports of horrific events, and also you've mentioned the word genocide. Now we're going to come on to it, but clearly what is going on in the Middle East now, triggered by the events of October the 7th, 2023. The reporting has been wild on you might say on all sides. Now in 20 years' time, I think it's going to be quite hard to look back at that and actually discern what did or didn't happen. How do you do that when you're looking back hundreds of years?
So one of the extraordinary things about the East India Company is the astonishing amount of archival material it left behind and which you can now consult. In the Anarchy, I wrote about its very first meeting, which took place in the Founders Hall in Moorgate Fields, which isn't a grotty tube station that it is today, but was literally fields outside London. It was a lovely, and the founders were the brass founders, so they had their own guild hall. And this was 1599 when Shakespeare was writing Hamlet. Shakespeare got stuck in the middle of writing To Be or Not to Be and decided to go for a walk while he thought over how this speech could end. He could have crossed London Bridge and been in the Founders Hall by about 25 minutes from the Globe Theatre, walking along the Thames. And anyway, I called up the minutes of that meeting, which is sitting in the British Library today, and there it is, the first subscribers in the very first meeting, the description of everyone that attended it. And from that point onwards, the East India Company has left this paper trail. And if you then go to India and the Indian archives, you get an even fuller picture, because you get the provincial archives. And what you have happening is something happens in Peshawar or Lahore, and the local guy sends a message to Calcutta. What you get in Peshawar and Lahore is the original message. You then get the message as it arrives in Calcutta, and that's kept now in the National Archives in Delhi, where the East India Company's Calcutta archives have been moved into the National Archives. And what you get in London in the British Library is the Leadenhall Street records kept at the head office. So you can follow a single event through different archives and see how it gets spun by the time that it gets back. So what you get in London, which is what most historians write their histories from, is the London end, and basically what they want the directors to think is happening. You get a slightly better view of the cock-up that's happened from the Calcutta archive. But the best of all, if you go to Allahabad or to Peshawar or Lahore and look at the regional archives, you understand, you find out all manner of things that have gone badly wrong, which, it gets filtered and polished and spun by the time that it gets to London. So there's an amazing amount. And the problem with the East India Company really is the sheer wealth of material. You have to sift through it and select. And it's obviously a very personal decision at the end of the day. I spent 5 years on each book, the 4 books that took 5 years each, but took about 20 years of my life. And with each book, you take decisions about what bits, of your notes you highlight and then eventually put into the book. And on top of all the official records, there are private archives which families find. And so you then select, you get more dissonant opinions of people from their diaries and their when they're not in official mode. The driest records are the official ones, the more colourful ones, people's private letters and particularly their private diaries, where they often commit their private thoughts. And so you actually can really reconstruct a world. And then you have the British press, and again a surprising degree of criticism of imperial atrocities, which I think people, I say, assume is a kind of modern sensibility. It isn't at all. People were as appalled by the 1772 famine then as they are now. So it's a very similar world with some people trying to make money, some people trying to save souls, some people crusading do-gooders who expose the money men. And you get the same, it's a very familiar mixture of different types operating against each other. But ultimately, as you say, it's every historian's own subjective opinion of what's significant and what isn't, and what is historically relevant and what is just, part of the chaff of history. And that's why there will never be a final history of anything. When future generations of historians will find new materials and things will look different to them. Even in my own time, though, I mean, what's extraordinary is that when I started in 1999 writing the first of these books, The White Mughals, I think, Google began that year and Amazon began that year. In the course of the 25 years I've been writing about these enormous corporations, we've seen new, massive, world-beating corporations emerge and have an unprecedented power, which one couldn't have anticipated at the time.
And actually on that, given the length of time and the way things do change, and of course, as you say, I absolutely get that ultimately you just have to make a decision. In any of that period, I suppose especially given what you've just said about how bad news gets sort of, ameliorated over the distance, let's say, and by the time it ends up, on somebody's desk, it looks a bit better than it was, or sometimes perhaps vice versa. Have you ever been surprised by something that's happened sort of years later to make you question something that you had originally settled upon as being the account of something, to have something sort of undone for you?
Yes, it's very interesting that, how when you're walking through a landscape, things can look differently. If you're looking, say, from the top of a valley than if you're in at the bottom of one. Well, modern history and contemporary events change the way you look at things. And I'll give you two examples of that. One is the subprime crisis, when suddenly all those big American corporations like Lehman Brothers were collapsing. You suddenly realized how vulnerable these enormous financial institutions were. One day they were bestriding the world, providing incredible salaries to their company employees. And the next day they're out on the street without a job, and the company's collapsed. The other thing, I suppose, is the response to the 7th of October in Gaza, which is something that, to me, has extraordinary parallels with the outbreak of the Indian Mutiny. The 1857 in Delhi opens with sepoys and cavalrymen riding in from Meerut and massacring, allegedly raping, and murdering women and children in cold blood. And this is reported in very lurid terms in Britain. And even figures like Dickens, who are famous champions of the underdogs, come out and say, delete Delhi, massacre every last one of them. These savages must be brought to book. I wrote this book on the Indian uprising called The Last Mughal, 10 years before the events of 7th of October. And therefore I knew how the rape of and massacre of innocents got reported then, and the parallel today, and the way that the reporting of atrocities created an environment where much greater atrocities could then be facilitated without criticism. And so very few voices in Britain complained about the way that the East India Company put down the uprising, where, for example, in Delhi, when they reconquered Delhi, which is the heart of the revolt, the gates of Delhi are locked, and every male above the age of 16 is massacred and bayoneted, pulled out for their hiding places, old men, young men. And we have diaries. One young man, I remember, Edward Vibart, who'd lost 2 sisters massacred at the Cawnpore massacre, and is expected to bayonet all the males in Delhi, writes a very moving letter when he says, "Hard must be that man's heart who can see an old man butchered. I am no sort of quaking liberal. I've lost 2 sisters to this revolt, but I'm disgusted to see the actions that I'm expected to perform on innocent people." And so there are fascinating parallels that exist between the events of in this history and seeing echoes of it in modern events today.
Yeah, well, I think that's fascinating. I think it's very well put, the words that you've chosen there, and I think that will make people think to a great degree as to exactly what it is that does, as you say, effectively justify or pave the way for inflicting mass violence upon people and
upon civilians.
Who are not
holding weapons.
Absolutely,
that's the key.
Indeed,
yeah.
indeed. Now, and therefore, you've sort of moved into territory that I did want to take you.
I suspected you did, so I have facilitated a bridge for you, Charles.
You did that, I think, very well, almost as though we'd rehearsed it. But I think where I'd like to go with it, again, not to try to shoehorn a comparison, but when you go back to the genesis of the East India Company, and you may know, I certainly don't, whether or not those that were there right in the early days had in their mind's eye a vision of the conquest that did in actual fact take place, the sort of
the founding charter of the East India Company does envisage conquest, the creation of armies and governance of tracts of territory. It's there in the 1599 charter issued by Elizabeth I on the very first moment of the East India Company's creation.
Okay, that is fascinating. Okay, so the Crown at that point was aware of the intentions of the company.
One thing that I didn't know, even when I first wrote about this, was that what was happening in the East India Company is also happening elsewhere in the world. So you get things like the Bahamas Company, which goes out to conquer the Bahamas, or the Rhode Island Company, which goes out to conquer Rhode Island, or the Virginia Company, which conquers Virginia, or the one that survived until I think recently. I think it's just been closed, the Hudson Bay Company, which certainly was there 10 years ago, so it was the East India Company was not at all unique. It was particularly successful and took the opportunity provided by the collapse of the Mughal Empire to move in and conquer this very rich territory. But similar outcomes were envisaged in North America, for example. And again, you have corporate colonialism preceding the Crown.
Yes. Okay, now, so the reason I ask that is because for most people, I think it's fair to say that because of what's happened since October 2023, which you've referred to, there's been a great focus on Israel and the history of the state of Israel. And I think for most people that goes pretty much as far back as the Balfour Declaration of 1917, but actually it goes back a long way before that. And I suppose the overlay is what was at that point the intent? Can we work backwards from now in terms of what it is we appear to be seeing Israel trying to do, and can we trace that back to 1917 and beyond?
So the founder of the idea of Zionism, Herzl, writes privately in his diary from the very beginning about the necessity of transferring, is the word he uses, Arabs out of the land of Israel, as he calls it, and moving them out. Initially, in his first tract called the Judenstaat, the Jewish state, he doesn't even once mention the population that is living there. But then subsequently, at the Zionist conferences, there's a famous delegation that come back and say the bride is very beautiful but is already married. There is already it's a lovely place, but someone's living there already. You find from many of the early Zionist leaders, including Ben Gurion, private, and also from Chaim Weizmann, private notes and letters and internal discussions where they make it clear that moving the existing population by force, if necessary, is going to be a necessary part of this. The British are more negligent. I mean, there's all the people. I think the only person in the cabinet who'd been to Palestine when it's discussed is Lord Curzon. And he's the only one who makes a real fuss, saying, there's an existing population. And in 1917, I think the situation is it was 96% Palestinian, Muslim and Christian, and only 4% Palestinian Jewish or recent arrivals. And therefore 96% of the population would have to be removed in order to create a Jewish state. Remember, the Balfour Declaration specifically says a Jewish homeland, which is an ambiguous statement, and leaves open what is to happen to what it calls the non-Jewish element of the population, which Balfour, I think, again, genuinely didn't know that 96% of them were not Jewish. I think he imagined that there must have been 50 or 60 or 70% Jewish population there. And the negligence with which the early 20th century British cabinet ministers simply dismiss the majority of the population. Balfour says, I don't think we will even go through the motions of asking for their opinion or having any sort of representative government. The wishes and prejudices of the Arabs who now inhabit that land are of far less importance, I think, is the words he uses, than the destiny of the Jewish people, is a phrase like that. And people just dismiss the population, which they don't seem even aware is there. And the Peel Report, which is one of the first commissions to try and work out what to do with this mess that's developing, with the local population becoming increasingly nervous and restive at the immigration and the fact that they're going to be marginalised in their own country, has an important footnote where he says that Balfour simply wasn't aware of the existing geography and the makeup of the population. And you have successive generations of colonial administrators who go there and see the situation whereby the terms of the mandate are set out to create a Jewish homeland, and they see on the ground what people in Whitehall are largely unaware of, which is that in order to do this, you have to marginalise the existing population. The book I'm writing at the moment is a history of the Palestinians, and I think it's very important to understand. And the main argument in my forthcoming book will be this: that the Palestinians who were there in 1917 and are there now as refugees in Gaza being bombed are the same people who were the Ottomans, largely 80% Muslim at the time of the Ottomans, who were the Byzantine Christians before them, who slowly convert to Islam in the 12th century, who were before that, many of them, the Jews who did not go into diaspora but converted to Christianity at the time of Constantine in the 2 centuries after that, who were before that pagan Canaanites. And so you have these extraordinary continuities which archaeologists are witness to, of single villages. The one I write about at the beginning of my new book is the village of 1947. It's called Izdud, the Arab name, but it had been called various variations of that name right back to the biblical Ashdod, when it was the center of the Philistines, who were one of the important ancestors of the Palestinians, but also the origin of the name. These people are known as the Peliset by the Egyptians from about 1177 BCE. They're known as the Palashtu by the Assyrians, and these people have deep, deep roots in the soil. And because the British administrators of the early 20th century were, many of them like Lloyd George, Christian Zionists who saw the politics there from religious point of view, and saw the destiny of the return of the Jewish people as something which was essential from a Christian point of view. They ignore or marginalize the rights of the people who were there. And the greatest irony, of course, is that DNA shows very clearly that both the Palestinians and particularly the Sephardic and Mizrahi Israelis are cousins, very close cousins, with almost identical DNA. The Ashkenazis have more admixture with Europeans from the centuries spent within Europe, but the Mizrahi Jews who lived in the Middle East have almost identical DNA to the Palestinians the other side of the political fence, and both of them are the inheritors of the same traditions of the Canaanites and the Bronze Age peoples who made up the origins of both groups. So it's a very tragic story. And, in my view, obviously some accommodation has got to be found whereby both groups can find self-determination and freedom.
Absolutely. Now, the thing that I would say is, again, a sort of link or an overlap, is that both these stories, the story of the East India Company and your comments earlier about the victory that the state held, in effect, over the company by sort of seeing it off, and indeed the conversion of that part of Palestine into what has become Israel. What we've seen in both instances is a change in the balance of power, and power doesn't disappear; it just transfers from one place to another. What I would like to do is sort of bring this up to date. Where do you see power lying now? I mean, the British Empire, we're told, has concluded many years ago. Is that really the case? I mean, is there still nuance there? Because, of course, like I said earlier, we are dealing really with individuals who have many fingers in many pies. Where
are you talking specifically about Palestine, or
I think
in general in the world?
I would say in the way that the world works now, is it possible that we are looking beyond, quite well beyond borders? Because it'd be possible to list a number of individuals and organisations that are involved in Israel, involved in the United Kingdom, in the United States, even in China, all at the same time. So how do you see, I suppose, the evolution or the change in what was the relationship back then between the East India Company and the state, as you describe it, and now, what exactly is it? What do we have? Do we have a relationship between corporations and states, or is it more complex than that?
So I think yes. I mean, obviously, the battle between the state and the corporation continues today, as it always has, and they both have different weapons. Corporate financing is still an important part of politics, and corporate donations to campaign funding is a crucial element. I think what we're seeing, looking at the longest term view as a historian, is that, as I said at the beginning, India and China controlled about 80% of the world's GDP for most of history. Now, this was obviously before America became a massively important industrial power. But we are seeing, 75 years after the India independence, the return of that equilibrium, which had been the case for most of history. So the rise of China, which has happened and is now the second biggest economy in the world, and the rise of India, which is happening more slowly, but which is gaining momentum. India just overtook Britain 3 years ago. It has overtaken Germany, I think, this year, and will overtake Japan to be the third economic power of the world by the end of the decade. So we're seeing slowly but steadily the return to the pre-colonial balance of the world, where most of output took place not in Europe but in Asia, particularly in the areas that are now China and India. And that, I think, is the big change that will happen in our lifetime and in the lifetime of our children. And I think Europe can be stronger if it is united and acts with a degree of unity, and I hope that will happen. And I think Brexit was a disaster from that point of view. But I think we're unlikely to see any increase of, shall we say, of European or British power in our lifetime. It's much more likely to slip away. And by the end of the century, it's going to be America, India, and China. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, I'd have said it was going to be China, which would be number one. I think it's now more an open question, with sort of Trump self-destructing American power in the way that he's managed to do, and facilitating the increasing rise of China in the way that he has unwittingly has unwittingly facilitated. I don't know whether I think it's an open question now, which will be the big power by the end of the century. But it's not going to be Europe. It's going to be India, China, or America.
And given that, and the incredible wealth that is contained within, particularly those eastern, India and China, do you think it's in any way conceivable that not exactly the aims, but the practices of an organisation like the East India Company could be seen again, as it were?
Yes, I think it's quite possible. I think we've seen over the last 20 years these companies, like these tech companies like Microsoft and Apple and Meta and X, enormously increase their power and their influence over the state. When Trump went to China, he brought the chief executives of those companies with him. With the exception of Elon Musk, they were all there. Nvidia, all these different groups, and I think they are powerful. But I think again, it's an open battle, the power of the state and the power of the corporation. It's not clear which the two will win. They both have advantages. In the early days of the East India Company, there's a wonderful moment when the Nawab of Arcot arrives, Nawab of the Carnatic arrives outside Madras and threatens to destroy it because they haven't paid any taxes for 3 or 4 years. And the Madras doesn't send out an army; it sends out a single bilingual spokesman, a guy called Nicola Manucci, who goes to Geshe. He speaks perfect Persian, which is the language of diplomacy in those days. And he says, we haven't got the military power to resist you. This is in the 17th century, before the East India Company became as powerful as it would be in the 18th century. But if you do attack us, the East India Company will just move up the coast to one of your neighbours and create a city where they go and make them prosperous. This is a place that can bring you enormous wealth. If you treat us well, you can share in that. But if you attack us, we will just go elsewhere. And this is the same argument that Amazon makes. Don't tax us, or we will withdraw. And this is the argument that has meant so many have moved, for example, to Ireland, where Ireland is now richer per capita, according to official statistics, than Monaco or Saudi Arabia, because all these companies are based in tax-free in Dublin. So there are parallels. I mean, I hope that it won't happen in the East India Company. We have a very good example of how this can go wrong, but there is certainly a possibility that we could end up with some sort of company like the company in the movie Avatar, the mining company, going to another planet and just looting and pillaging all the minerals to send back home. That could be the future.
Well, absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, that is exactly what people are already discussing. Now, I mean, I think the reason I asked that is really, the idea, or at least, do you consider that the state and corporate interest are in fact divergent? I mean, you've talked about the incredible power of corporate lobbying, and look at the sort of revolving door mechanism where you've got people coming into one and going immediately out to the other, or whichever way round. I mean, do you think that in actual fact, although we are given the impression that the state and the corporations are supposedly acting independently or indeed pursuing different interests, but the way you look at that now, do you really consider that to be the case?
I think the best answer to that is the statement of the Lord Chancellor at the trial of Warren Hastings when he's brought to trial in 1780, and he says, corporations have neither souls to be condemned nor bodies to be punished. They therefore do as they like. And corporations will use all the powers at their disposal to make the maximum profits for themselves, and it's up to the state to regulate them. And it's an open question whether the state will do that, or whether they can be lobbied into submission.
Do we ever see anything new? You've spent decades researching, and you have seen a huge amount of this incredible evolution of a company. We've talked quite a lot about the present day, or we've brought ourselves up to the present day. Do you see anything new in the way that the state or the corporate beast behaves?
I think, in its broadest outlines, almost everything that we see today is there in the history of the East India Company, which is why studying it is so fascinating. And in a sense, a lot of the stuff which didn't seem important when I started this study 25 years ago, you can now see with the growth of Meta and X and the position of Elon Musk in government, how an East India Company could happen again.
Okay, and on that note, look, this has been wonderful, but just very quickly, do you have a title or a publication date for your book?
No, it's very early days. At the moment, the working title is just The Palestinians. But I'm
okay,
sure
that's fine. That's good enough. We'll look out for it. But then, otherwise, where would you direct people that want to follow more about what you do? Website, social media, any of that sort of thing?
So I have published 11 books, which are under my name, so you can find those in bookshops. And I have a podcast called Empire, which I do with the wonderful Anita Anand, which is under the Goalhanger banner, and which has just passed 90 million downloads in 2 years. So it's been a surprising change to my life from that point of view.
And you're on Elon Musk's platform X, I think, but I can't remember what's your name.
I am Dalrymple Will.
Okay, brilliant. Well, look, I'll put notes below this interview. William Dalrymple, thank you very much indeed for joining me on UK Column. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Charles. Bye-bye.
The UK Column is very pleased to have announced the first issue of a print magazine, a quarterly called The Column. So please go to shop.ukcolumn.org to find out more and get your hands on a copy.